Alright, I'm ready to mark the bird's mouth and tail cut for my jack rafter. Recall that a jack rafter is just a common rafter. It's exactly the same as a common rafter from the bottom, looking at the bottom of the rafter. The top will cut to fit our hip rafter, which will be at a 45-degree angle relative to the jack rafter. But the bottom half of the jack rafter is exactly like a common rafter. So I simply need to measure the theoretical and overall lengths and mark those like I would a common rafter. 19 1/4 is my theoretical mark, so I'll mark that line on the top edge of my board, as well as 21 5/8 for the overall length. I'll take my speed square, and again, I am now back using the common rafter scale of my speed square. I am no longer using the hip rafter scale. So I'll set the pivot point to my mark I made for my theoretical. I'll pivot that until I get my 8/12 on the common rafter scale and mark my plumb cut. I'll do the same for my overall length. Pivot point on my mark, my common rafter scale at 8, and mark my plumb line. I'm now ready to mark my bird's mouth, and recall that my height above plate is 2.5 inches. So I'll slide my square back up to there, mark my 2.5 inch point, my height above plate, and take my framing square, line one edge up with my plumb cut and my height above plate, and mark my seat cut. So here's my seat cut that I will cut out. For my common rafter, I have my 2.5 inch height above plate from there to there. So that is my height above plate, and that is my tail cut. These are both square cuts, just like a common rafter. The head of my jack rafter is going to be very different than the head of a common rafter. It's actually going to be somewhat similar to how we did the head of the hip rafter, and that will pull back a certain distance and will mark a 45-degree line. The head cut of your top jack rafter should be set back 3/8 of an inch from the start of the board to the very point of your top cut of your jack rafter, and cut back at a 45-degree angle. So I am going to mark a 45-degree angle on the top edge of my jack rafter, which will represent the face of my hip and the top end of my jack rafter. Depending on which side of the hip this jack rafter goes on, we'll either mark a diagonal this way or we'll mark a diagonal this way. One will be a left-hand version and one will be a right-hand version. We'll start and we'll mark this one going this way, which will sit on the right-hand side of our hip rafter. So this diagonal line represents the cut line of my jack rafter. I can now mark a plumb line on either side of my board from either the short point or the long point. Which you choose doesn't necessarily matter. I'm going to choose to go by the long point. So I'm just going to make a reference line right about there, put my speed square pivot point on that mark, and pivot my speed square for an 8/12 common pitch. I'm using the common rafter scale, not the hip scale for this rafter. 8/12 pitch, and mark the plumb cut. So there is the top edge of my jack rafter. I've included my opposite hand jack rafter to illustrate how I would cut the other side of the hip jack rafter. So one side bevels to the left and the other side bevels to the right. plumb cut, plumb cut. They will ultimately install on either side of the hip rafter in this orientation with the hip rafter going in between them.